we're moving along with our questions and answers, and they're going well, and I think everybody's really appreciated them. I have, for sure, because it means that the one question goes out to hundreds of people or thousands of people. This is question session number 5, and the first question on the page here is: I've struggled with milling stock by hand, particularly with edge planing. When I watch you do it, you check one spot and say it's square. When I check mine, it might be perfect for the first 8 inches, then the next 6 will be out a little. I usually use calipers to check with within a 64th. Am I missing something here, or am I trying to get everything too perfect? Is there such a thing as too perfect? I think that's the issue, really, is we strive for perfection. We strive to get things as straight and as square as possible, and that's the essence of what craftsmanship is all about. So no, I don't think there is such, I don't really agree with perfectionism as such. I think we just strive for perfection, and I think that's very important, as any crafting artisan will tell you. And so you say, when I scribe a line all the way around the board, I always end up going past the line, often because it's out of square. I understand this, and I think it's a complex, more complex, really, to try to address it, but I'm going to try. I've got 4 or 5 different points that I want to make here. First and foremost, we often don't realize the importance of setting the plane. So when we set the cutting iron here, we want this side to be the same distance as this side, absolutely as near to perfect as we can get it. If we're 1,000th out, then it's going to reflect, because every time we take a shaving, it keeps dipping the plane to one side or the other until we're out of square consistently, or even more so, we keep going out of square. So that's the most important thing. We've got a video on that, how to set the plane. I think it works better than anything I've ever seen, and I think it will help you to get started with setting your plane. So that's important. So focus on that. And then the other thing is that once you've set the plane to the right depth, sometimes the board itself, the edge of the board, as in this one here, this one's square, and I've just checked it. I think I did, yeah, this one. I just checked it for square after I'd finished it. So there we are, dead square. If this was slightly out of square, we offer the plane to it, then we tend to move out of square because we're already sloping in one direction. But there is something else. Let me give you a quick look at this here, because we do so many different things. The way you hold the plane to the edge really matters. So we tend to do a couple of things when we're using a plane. Because of our body position, we tend to skew the plane this way. And we see people doing that, experts like myself. We see other people skewing it. We think, oh, that's the right way to do, that's the optimum cut. It is good to get a skewed or a slice cut that way in a pairing way, but it's not really the most practical for what we're doing. We do this because our body is overhanging the bench and we're working this way. We can't really put the piece of wood directly in front and have equal access from both sides. So we tend to skew. So we tend to slope it a little bit, and that makes it more difficult to keep it square to the work. So what we should try to do, whereas we can still skew it, we try to align the length of the sole of the plane with the long axis of the piece of wood. So the full length is registered, albeit from corner to corner, and that maximizes the length of the stroke. So there we have it. And I'm shooting for the middle of my piece of wood. So if I'm only playing short pieces of wood, I will actually keep the plane square as I can along the long axis. And can you see, whoops, I have this, it was centered right in the throat, so I'm not working either side. As soon as I move the plane over to one side of the other like this, then the weight of the plane, the weight of my hand tends to tilt the plane ever so slightly. So try to keep it near to the center, try to develop that sensitivity to the plane. And the other thing I see a great deal is this: when we're bulldogging the piece of wood, we lock our shoulders as though we're in a full Nelson position in a wrestling match, and we're trying to immobilize our opponent. And that's not really what we're doing. What we want to do is develop this sensitivity. So when we offer the plane to the wood, we're very much more relaxed about it. And that's the way we do it. So I think if you relax, try to ease up on it. And then the other thing is, like I said, once we go with the plane offset to one side, then we tend to dip to that side because we have the extra weight. Go to this side, we tend to go to that side. So the ideal is to get it centered on the piece of wood and then try and even out the pressure until we get a full width, full length shaving, and then we start checking ourselves for square. And if we're slightly off, what do we do when we're slightly off? Let's say that my piece of wood is sloping this way here. If I put my plane, instead of trying to correct this by tilting the plane, I would put the plane onto the piece of wood like this on the one side. So I'm over this side, take a shaving. See, that only took a very thin shaving. 1, 2, and the shaving is getting wider. It's still not full width. Now it's full width. So I tilted my plane by just offering one side of the plane to the work. Practice it. That's the important thing, is keep practicing, and then by practice you'll become much more self-confident, you'll be more adept with the plane, and then you won't feel this rigidity, which is always an enemy of good workmanship. The next question here this is from Josh, and he says, when I'm using my chisels, I sometimes get cut by the edges. That's the corner forming the length of the chisel. Let me give you a clue what we're talking about here. Here are 3 different chisels. And we're basically talking along this edge here. So when you're hand sharpening, it becomes an issue because we tend to put our fingers like this on the chisel blade and we start moving it along the stones this way. So our 2 fingertips are very much on this corner here. When these brand new chisels, often this will be very sharp here and here. So whereas the sides of chisels are usually not actually dead 90 degrees, they're only 1 or 2 degrees out of square very often. But when you buy a chisel, a set of chisel like this one is pretty much a brand new chisel, and this corner actually has been eased ever so slightly by the manufacturer, and that's very good. That's what you really want. So if you don't have that, if your chisels have been flattened, take a piece of abrasive paper and take just 2 swipes on the corner. That's all it takes. You don't want to round it magnificently. We don't want a big round on there, but just ease that edge and avoid the first 1 inch. That doesn't, your fingers aren't usually in that position. Your fingers are usually above it. So here's a chisel that was manufactured by Veritas. It's got a 60-degree side on here, and that means that this is very much a cutting edge. There is no easing of this corner, and you would have to do that if you were using hand sharpening methods. That is, you're not using a honing guide. This was designed, I think, to be used with a honing guide, so it's housed in a guide, so your fingers are not on the corners like this. But most of us that really want to get on with the job don't want to use a honing guide. We want to get straight to the chisel edge. You would have to ease this edge quite substantially, but just avoid that first 1 inch so you're not rounding these corners, so you do get that crisp sharpness into the corners, and that will resolve the issue for you. But definitely you will have to ease the edges on a lot of chisels. All right, next question. Okay. Question here with nobody asking this question. Why have you positioned the face vise where you have your workbench? This is just a vise. I know often people call it a face vise for some reason, and I suppose because it fits on the front of the bench, but they all fit on the front of the bench. But this is the best position. This is where my leg is, and I have another leg here. So my vise is suspended between 2 very rigid fixed points. That means when I'm pounding on the bench here, and with whatever I have in the vise here, I get this locked rigidity that is very wonderful, especially if you're chopping mortises, things like that. As soon as I go outboard to this point, and especially if I'm working on a bench that does not have aprons, like all my benches have aprons, for this very reason. As soon as I go to this outside edge, when I start pounding on here, I get a lot more vibration. So this questioner is asking whether they could put the vise at this end of the bench. Yes, they could, but you do get a little bit of compromise, not a lot if you've got an apron vise. And then the other question is, when this is in this position on the whole length of the bench, why do I put my vise to this end of the bench? Well, I'm right hand dominant, and this is the reason. So I want all of my tools that I'm working with to be available to my right hand. I place them away from me with my right hand. If I was using my left hand, I would be reaching over here to pick up the tools. So I pick up my chisel, get to work, put it back. So it's either in front of me or to my right. If I was left hand, I would definitely put the vise at the opposite end of the bench, still inside the leg of the bench, but I would put it over to that side. So if I was left hand, I would be planing, pick up my planes, put them back. And that's the reason we do that. So I think that will help you make those decisions. You can put your bench vise right in the middle if you want to. It's just handy to have this positioning for your body, have your tools to your right or left hand, depending on which you're dominant with. Would it be okay to mount 9? Okay, we've dealt with that. Question. Trevor, in Canada, our 2x4s have rounded edges and are actually 1.5 by 3.5. This is the American 2x4, very much so. Developed in America, and it was developed for speed of application. It was developed because it was much easier to handle and to mass make housing. So you put a round over on every corner of anything that's a dimensional lumber that you use in house building, and it's much more comfortable for the user. So it was a great idea. The problem is when you're making a workbench, you don't have those square edges. And here is an example here. So we've got rounds here and here and here. And this person is asking, if you've got these, do you plane them off first? Do you plane them off after? I would just plane them after you've glued up your laminated top. Just do it that way. His question actually says, with regards to making a workbench, would it be wise to rip all the boards from 2x12s and the legs from 2x6s? There's nothing wrong. You could indeed rip that stock that way. The problem is that I'm addressing 90% of people who do not have a bandsaw, do not have a rip saw, a table saw of any kind, and they just want to get on with the work. So we're using this type of lumber, and we try to give the best answers we can. So generally people are buying dimension lumber, and they are going to have to plane down these surfaces. But don't be daunted, it does not take very long to plane those surfaces down to square edge stock. Do I ever use a coping saw when cutting a dovetail? I do, sometimes, maybe, possibly. There's no fixed answer for this. If I'm making a tool tote or a beehive or perhaps even a toolbox, I would take a coping saw to remove the bulk of the waste and then chop the remaining level down to the shoulder line. And that is quite quick, but it's not massively quicker than just chopping it out the way you would generally see me in one of my videos. If you want to see a video on that, just go to Paul Sellers and look for my video on how to cut a dovetail, and it shows the precise way. What I'm trying to do is extend everything I do to an audience that is wanting to master true skill, wanting to become competent a competent woodworker, furniture maker. So I want them to use the methods that actually slow down the process, not mass manufacture the process, just to get in the zone and enjoy the process. And it's very enjoyable not to use the coping saw. The coping saw doesn't always cut exactly to the line. It doesn't always do exactly what you want. Sometimes the blade twists. It's hard to find good coping saw blades. Sometimes it dips in the cut and you've ruined your work. This is my method. I think using the knife wall and then chopping, paring to that knife wall is the best method. Okay, now then. Okay, I've got this in bold. It says the next two could be taken together. When chopping housings, I noticed that you sometimes use the chisel bevel up and sometimes bevel down. And personally, I find it somewhat awkward to use it bevel up because of its tendency to dig in. Can you please explain your reasoning behind doing bevel up or bevel down? there's a couple of questions here. I use the bevel down when the wood is wider, so that if I was pairing across here with this chisel here, you can see the bolster here would stop me from getting all the way across, especially would this be so if it was twice as wide. So I would tend to take out the bulk this way and then flip over and take out the remaining waste with the bevel down. You're saying that you find it more difficult, and I think that's possibly true, but it could be down to experience, because when you actually do cut a housing dado like this, let me give you a quick demo. I won't go too deep. Like this. What I usually do is shoot for the sky. So I start here, start low, and I work upwards like this. So I'm shooting for the stars. Then I come in with a double-handed cut here, and gradually, so I'm still shooting for the stars, and I just let the chisel drop with each subsequent level that I go to. And then usually you'll see me in different ways. Now if this was a wide board, I would go with the bevel down and I would go through that way too. So that's when we would alternate between the two, but it's not really, this is very accurate. I find that if I do it this way, it doesn't really tend to dig in, but I start shooting for the sky and I just drop my hand very gradually and take off maybe 0.5 millimeter or less at a time. So that works great. Okay. What about the depth of a dado? This is another question somebody's asking. The depth of a dado, is there a rule of thumb like 1/3 depth or whatever? If this was 3 inches wide and I had a shelf coming in here, no, I wouldn't go 1 inch deep. There is no point. I would probably max out. Most housing dados only need to go certainly no more than 1/2 inch, and I would stop at that. Most of my housing dados would be 3/8 of an inch if it was 1.5 inch piece of wood. If it was 3/4 like this, I would go no more than 1/4 of an inch, possibly 3/16, and that would be it. There isn't really, you can't look back into some old journal or manual where it says cut the dado this deep, that being the maxim that we use. There isn't really a maxim, it's just what's practical. And because this joint is almost always used with dead weight for shelving, going 1/2 inch deep is very much as you need. All right. When reading the grain, you have mentioned that sapwood will have to be discarded. Why is that? It's a good question, that. I think perhaps I should qualify that. Sapwood is always almost a light colour. It's usually lighter than the rest of the wood, and it usually stays light, that colour. It usually has, it doesn't alter. It's not heartwood. It hasn't fully developed into heartwood, and it never will develop into heartwood once the tree is cut. The dead wood is the wood that's the heartwood. That's the inside of the tree. The sapwood is the wood that's really still growing but has been stymied, stopped from cutting by the severance from its root to the earth. So that wood remains sapwood, and it never changes, or very rarely does it change colour in your favour. The heartwood will usually be darker, the outside sapwood will be lighter, and it's very stringy. Usually it has a different texture to the heartwood. The heartwood has reached its maximum state, it's dead now, and it's not going to change. The outside wood is still stringy, and it takes the finish differently. It will absorb and contract differently than the heartwood. So that's really the reason, mostly. Cherry especially will remain absolutely a creamy white colour. The heartwood will go from almost a similar colour, but it will go a very deep honey colour, and that will show it contrast markedly with the rest of the wood. Okay. If I were aiming to joint an apron to a leg with a mortise and tenon joint and wanted a small reveal, would I move the mortise or the tenon? Good question. I think sometimes we don't realise why we position tenons where we do. If we have a leg, like this one here, and we have a rail going in here like this into here, we usually try to move the tenons. We've discussed this before, I think, in Q&As. We usually move this to the outside. If we go too much to the outside, show you here, if we make this too thin, then this becomes very weak on the outside edge. So we try to set some kind of a standard, and most often I think that we would very rarely go nearer to the outside face on a leg than say 1/4 of an inch. 1/4 of an inch would be about the closest you could get to the outside edge without weakening it. If you go in the middle, of course, you're shortening the length of your tenon when you have two tenons intersecting here. So there are reasons for having that. So that's the reason we do that. Sometimes we will offset the shoulders on the tenon, so we'll have a bigger shoulder on one side and less on the other side. Instead of it being dead centered in the rail, maybe like this and this, we would have it offset. And I think that's important to see, that we often compensate for joints that way. Okay, so there's really no fixed answer to that question. I think you just learn which is going to be the best for different applications. The more mortise and tenon joinery do, the more you'll start thinking through. You'll think about the weaknesses and you'll think about the strengths, and you'll compensate instead of compromise for whatever you want in your particular project.